Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Doing great today, Tim. It's been a fantastic start to 2023. The work over here just never seems to cease, and we are embracing all of it. I hope everyone out there is doing well in the early stages of this new year. But overall, how are you doing, Tim?
Thanks for asking, Lance. I am doing great. And I am excited to share this series that we recorded back in the fall of 2019, Lance, in Saratoga Springs, New York. And we aired it on the Crawlspace podcast, but we wanted to bring it to Missing to introduce it to a new audience. And of course, we have a lot of new listeners now who haven't heard this originally. So we want to play this in its entirety for 7 straight episodes, and then we'll have something fresh for the 8th episode in this series. And it's about the unsolved murder of Sheila Shepherd, Lance.
And this one holds a pretty special place in our hearts and our catalog of work in our experience doing this, because it's the first time that any law enforcement agency, this is a Saratoga Police Department, allowed us to go into their police department and look at case files from Sheila's murder and work with the detectives, 2 great detectives, Callahan and Wilson, and even an old detective who was on the case originally, Tom Mitchell. So it was really unique to us in that way. And you did mention that this is something that aired previously on Crawlspace. And by airing it again on Missing, this is sort of the purpose of what we do with this true crime podcasting and raising awareness and being advocates. Yes, it still exists on Crawlspace, but we are always gaining new listeners, and we're always trying to make sure that the previous stuff that we have put out there, people's stories are still being told. So this is the purpose for doing that. Sheila's story is still unsolved, and by re-airing this, it regenerates a new audience or new interest in her murder.
And Sheila's case is a cold case from Saratoga Springs, New York. She was 22 years old when her body was discovered in her apartment on November 25th, 1980. And if you have any information in this case, please call the Saratoga Springs Police Department at 518-584-8477. And this audio has been remastered, and we are releasing more video than we did the first time with this. So you can find that on YouTube at youtube.com/missingcsm.
And speaking of finding things, Tim, if one wanted to find this episode remastered without the ads, where would one go?
If you want to hear this without the ads, you can now subscribe to Missing Premium via Apple Podcasts. But if you don't use Apple, you can sign up at missing.supportingcast.fm, and it's just $4.99 a month. You get every episode of Missing ad-free, plus you also get our weekly bonus show.
And speaking of finding things, Tim, how would one find us on social media if one were looking for us on social media?
Easy. You can find us at Missing CSM. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody.
The naked body of Sheila Shepherd was found in her Saratoga apartment this morning by her uncle. She was found lying on her bed with stab wounds. Her family had been notified when her teacher had become worried. The 22-year-old woman was enrolled in a work-study program at the Worldwide Educational Center just down the street from her apartment. She missed class yesterday. Her teacher thought she just might be out of town. Today, the teacher became worried.
Because usually our enrollees will call in and tell us why they aren't here for the day to work. So that's why we tried to find out her whereabouts this morning.
The teacher described Sheila as a beautiful girl who was well-liked. She had been married and reportedly has a young child, but she lived alone. Police spent hours on the scene collecting evidence. After the body was taken away, police brought out several bags of evidence, but they had little to say.
Do you have any reason to believe that this was someone who knew her, though, or this could be a random kind of crime?
We have no reason to believe that statement whatsoever, whether it was a random situation or someone knew her or what. We don't know at this point.
So far, police have very little to go on. One clue. A next-door neighbor's daughter says she heard screaming about 10:15 last night. But Sheila's teacher says that when they checked on her yesterday morning, the door was locked and a radio was playing. The door was still locked and the radio was still playing this morning when Sheila was found. Mike Moran, 13 News, Saratoga.
Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance in the Crawlspace studios in Wormtown. Lance, how are you today?
Doing really well. How are you doing today, Tim?
I'm doing well, and today, Lance, for this episode, we have the beginning of some casework that we're doing again. Feels good.
Yeah, it feels good to be back in Wormtown in the Crawlspace studios, as I like to say, nestled here in the Crawlspace studios. But last week, we were up in Saratoga Springs, New York, and we were walking around with two very fine police detectives and talking about a coming up on 40-year-old unsolved murder. And you're right, it felt good to take charge of that.
Yeah, beautiful town, Saratoga Springs, and we met with investigators Chris Callahan and Matt Wilson of the Saratoga Springs Police Department. They were nice enough to allow us to spend a couple of days with them, really, or maybe a day and a half. And so we met these fine gentlemen in Albany, New York, earlier this year, Lance, in April of 2019. They saw our panel with that snappy jacket wearing John Lorden and with the true crime guy, Mike Morford, the one that we did at the American Investigative Society of Cold Cases.
It's really crazy how these things come together. So that was back in April, and we do this panel, which is pretty much I guess kind of a broad stroke of how you maintain a true crime podcast and just how you go about your daily day-to-day business with it. And they heard that, and they thought to themselves that this might be something to incorporate in this particular murder that they're looking into. And the next thing that falls into place for this is their superiors say, you have pretty much carte blanche to do whatever you want with this if it's going to shake something loose. And being a part of it is really, really special.
Yeah, they must have liked something that we set up there. You know, we were also talking about how we work with law enforcement and with families and try to shake loose tips and things like that, and that is what they're looking for. So if you know any information in the murder of Sheila Shepherd, this is an unsolved murder from Saratoga Springs, New York in 1980. So if you know anything, if you have any information, please call the tip line. The number is 518-584-8477. That's 518-584-8477. And that number is in the show notes, as well as Investigator Callahan's direct line.
We can probably say that this is the first episode that we're going to do on Sheila Shepherd. There's going to be a series of episodes. It's the only unsolved murder in Saratoga Springs history. It was also profiled by the great John Douglas, who was essentially the founder of the behavioral science unit of the FBI. So there's a profile written on this case and who might have committed this crime. But just from a layman point of view, not being a detective, you look at this and it's bizarre right off the bat for so many reasons. And you'll hear this unfold during this interview.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating case, and what we find out through the course of this conversation that we have with investigators Callahan and Wilson, we find out that the killer spent some time with the body after he or she killed Sheila.
Now, Sheila was murdered right before Thanksgiving. They found her body on November 25th. They estimated her to be murdered probably 2 days before that, over the weekend. She was 22 years old. And she had just moved back into the area. She'd been there for a few months. She had a young daughter, and she was estranged from her husband. When you look at a murder that has a clear rage element to it, multiple stab wounds or bruising, you can put together a much more solid scenario as to what happened. And what really is a brain scratcher on this one, to give a John Lorden shout out here, is that there's no bruising, there's no signs of struggle. She's tied to a bed, but there's no multiple bruising marks or tie marks on her wrists or her feet. Like, where she was tied was where her limbs stayed. All of this seems to be post-mortem.
That's right, Lance. So the killer spent some time with Sheila after he or she killed her, and he or she also stabbed Sheila in the abdomen once, as we go over in the interview with the investigators. But what we found out from our new friend at the University of New Hampshire, she's a forensic anthropology professor. Her name's Amy Michael. we found out that the killer spent no less than a half an hour with Sheila after killing her because the puncture wound of the knife, there was no blood.
We were told that. We were told that there was one single drop of blood, but when we saw the picture of the knife in the body, I didn't see any drop of blood. It must have been incredibly minute, but it was only from the initial puncture wound into her stomach. And what we found out from Amy at the University of New Hampshire, because what occurred to us was how long would somebody have to stay with the body in order for the blood to stop flowing to the point where it's not coming out from a stab wound. And what we found out from Amy at UNH was based on the lack of blood flow from the wound and the discoloration on Sheila's body, that knife would have had to have gone into her, like you said, no sooner than a half hour after the death. And we're not even sure how she exactly died, as you'll find out in this interview. She had a piece of fabric stuffed in her mouth, but that doesn't really cause the level of asphyxiation that they're talking about. There was no vomit in the throat. There was essentially no sign of her trying to get this thing out of her mouth. So that could have been post-mortem as well. And I mentioned the discoloration on her body from the blood. That suggests a certain period of time that she was laying there, which is how they determined that she was probably murdered Saturday into Sunday, and she was discovered on Tuesday. So it was a couple of days worth of this lividity of blood.
Yeah, and so you can see why this is a really interesting case. It's still unsolved. There was a profile done by John Douglas, which we got a little bit of info from. All right, so I think you'll really enjoy this series. You will be hearing more from the Sheila Shepherd case, investigators Chris Callahan and Matt Wilson.
And might I say, Tim, you'll be hearing more and you'll be seeing more because we took a crew up with us. We took a film crew up with us, and we interviewed not only Matt and Chris, we also interviewed the original detective from the case, and we interviewed Sheila's aunt, whose husband at the time was the one who actually found Sheila's body. So, guys, just when you thought we weren't going to dig deep.
Thanks, guys, for coming back and talking about this case with us.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so you brought in some of these pictures, and we'll just start at the beginning. Sheila Shepherd was 22 years old, and she was murdered on November 25th of 1980. Can you take us back to the scene of the crime?
Well, what was thought from the time of death, coroner's report, police investigation, they think she was actually killed. November 25th was a Tuesday morning. That's when she's found, when the police investigation begins. What was determined was that she was actually killed sometime late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, which have been the 22nd into the 23rd. The timeline's a little hazy on when she's last confirmed seen alive, but it's going to be some point on that Saturday, and then there's different sightings, different people are interviewed that were out in our downtown area in Saratoga on that Saturday night that say they saw her at certain bars, but then a lot of them are kind of hazy. Like, well, I can't be sure if it was actually Saturday into Sunday, may have been Friday into Saturday, but she's definitely found for sure on Tuesday morning, early morning. Again, she's enrolled in a secretarial school at the time, was called Worldwide Enterprises, right down the block from her apartment. The teacher had sent a couple of students over to look for her. She didn't report for class 2 days in a row, and once they couldn't get into the apartment, got no response, knocked on the doors. When they go back, teacher calls Sheila's mother, who comes to the house with her aunt and uncle, and the uncle's one who comes through. The picture on the left there is that's the fire escape that he comes in through, that you could see from when we were at the apartment yesterday. He came up that fire escape because the front door was locked, stepped through the window, and actually has to step right over
her.
Yes, yeah. And she was, according to him, she was found. She was covered with a blanket or sheet at that time, but like the feet were sticking out. He calls out to her. There's no response, so he says it's obviously there's something wrong there going on. He pulls back the sheet and sees that, she does appear to be deceased. And then goes and calls the police, and our investigation begins from there.
I can imagine that he saw her through the window.
He said he could see her through the window, but again, that she's covered.
Yeah.
So he knows she's in the bed there, but just that she's not responding to his calling out her name.
And he can't see anything other than part of her head. Was her head fully covered, or was it?
I think it says the head was fully covered. There was a leg protruding out of the side of the sheet.
Okay.
I think he sees on this bottom right here something like that. You know,
The
you
foot
saw
coming
that.
out.
That there's someone in the bed.
And her feet are tied with her own shoelaces.
Correct.
Yes, and then this is like a what do you call it?
Terry
like
cloth.
A belt, yeah, from
For a
the
robe.
terry cloth robe. That's
Okay, that's
tying her hand.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what the fourth tie is now.
I believe it's going to be something similar to there's two shoelaces and I think two kind of sashes like that tying the hands.
And that was Sheila's robe.
We believe so, yeah.
And she's tied spread eagled, so she's got all, 2 hands, 2 feet that are, all directions tied to the bed frame. But even just looking closely at it, it doesn't really appear that, she's tied down before death, because the shoelaces are flimsy. They're not any sort of intricate knots. They said they were kind of like just like a double overhand, like you tie your shoe with, and there's no abrasion marks on her. It doesn't look like anything she's struggling against the ties. So the theory was, and it definitely, I agree, that makes sense that she's tied up after she's already dead.
And what else happened after she died?
She had a what was it? A blouse.
It's a belt that went to like a coat, like a cloth belt that went to a woman's coat, or maybe a sweater or something, like a throw. We actually spoke to the owner of that. She said she had let her borrow it, but it was like a cloth sash that was tied over her mouth, stuffed down into her mouth, and then the steak knife was piercing her abdomen.
There was a steak knife.
Correct.
So all that was after she was dead.
The one single stab wound, there's no blood coming from the area. I think there might be a drop where it pierces the flesh, but it's not like, if you stab someone and they're alive and they're actively still, still spurting blood. So it looks like it's probably even, I wouldn't say quite a while, but it's, time has passed that she's been dead before somebody sticks this knife into her abdomen, which obviously is the part that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. Was it from her apartment?
It matches the set that she has in her in her kitchen drawer. There's actually original detectives had pictures in there of all the cutlery, and had seized all this other cutlery that we still have now that matches her set. So it looks like somebody just
went through her set.
Yeah, I don't know if it's
If it was sitting on the table,
spontaneous
yeah.
or
So what is the cause of death?
asphyxiation.
So, like someone suffocated her or strangled her, or?
No, wouldn't have been strangled. Would have been suffocated, or that
The belt or whatever.
Yeah, if that's down, if that's restricting her airway. The only thing that with that is there's not a lot of vomit on her or from or on that object, which you would think if that is the actual item that caused the death, that would have caused some sort of gag, reflex and vomit, but could have been a pillow placed over her head. We obviously can't say for sure on that.
What was her life like? Who was she?
Well, she was pretty much born and raised in Saratoga Springs. Her father had her when he was in the military, stationed down in Florida. Has Sheila down there. She was born in 1958. They moved back to Saratoga Springs. She's very young. Grows up there. She ends up meeting a guy who's also in the military that she gets married to. They go away. Well, he's stationed different places. They're stationed in Germany. He's then stationed in California.
She lived in Germany?
Yes. Then in California with him, they have a young daughter, as you can see in some of the pictures. She was 3 at the time that Sheila was murdered. Sheila had left her husband in California. They had split up, and she went to live in Colorado for a time, which is the ones you can see with the mountains in the background there. That is her her Aunt Terry that you're going to meet later on today. That's actually the wife of the uncle who discovers Sheila in the apartment.
Terry.
Terry Armstrong was married to Charles Bousseau at the time, who's the one that goes through the window and finds her. But she left California where her husband was stationed, took the baby to Colorado and stayed with Terry and Charles for a time there.
So that's where Terry was living in Colorado? That's why
Yes.
they went there?
Mm-hmm.
And then she made her way back to Saratoga Springs after that?
Yes, her husband actually comes and takes the baby with her permission, takes their daughter Sativa, comes back to Saratoga, where his parents are living in the time, or just outside of, and then Sheila, a little while later, makes her way back to Saratoga. I want to say in August of 1980.
Yeah, end of August or August.
So the kid was living in Saratoga as well, in the same town as Sheila, but just not in the same residence.
Well, just outside. It's
Okay.
it's called Greenfield. It's just like the kind of rural surrounding
Okay.
area of Saratoga. His parents ran an RV park
Okay.
there that the daughter was with Richard Shepherd's parents.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
And how long after they split up, Sheila and Richard, was she killed?
May of 1980 is when she moves back to Saratoga for good, and in 1978 is when her and Richard had split up.
Oh, okay.
And that's when a couple of years,
Okay.
2 years, and
But they maintained contact.
yeah,
between
yeah,
them.
they had been in contact. It sounds like, and from everyone that we've talked to, there was no custody dispute. There was no fighting over who should have the baby. It seemed like they both kind of agreed that the baby was better off with his parents. That neither one were in a really good place to raise a child at the time.
She was like 20.
She was 22 when
19
she
or-
died.
Well, when she had the baby.
Yes. Yep. She gets married married to him in '76. They moved to Germany. They moved. Okay, so I want to say that Sativa was born in '77. Her daughter, so she
Yep.
would have been, 19.
19. And how old was he?
Richard, I don't have his exact date of birth memorized. He's a couple years older,
Okay.
but he's also early 20s.
Yeah. It's impressive that they would have the self-awareness to say the child's not,
Yeah,
in the
Yeah.
best hands with us
that seems
at that age.
right. Pretty mature, both of them. He had been to Saratoga a couple months before she's killed. Actually, maybe like a month and a half. And they had apparently he was coming to Saratoga to talk about, what's our plan going forward. Are we gonna split totally? Are we gonna try to get back together? Are we gonna, see if we can make this work? And it sounds like at that time that they both come to an understanding that no, this is not going to work. It's not what we want going forward. And like I said, apparently there's no issue over custody or who's going to have the child, because even after she's killed, Sativa ends up living with his parents going forward. So he never actually retained custody or got full custody at any point, even after the baby's mother is killed.
So they were trying to work it out from like May. She moved back permanently, 1980.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, May of '80, January of 1980. It sounds like she comes back to Saratoga for a visit from when she's out in Colorado, and then goes back out west, and then in May moves home for good. Gets enrolled in this secretarial school down the street, and is putting all her friends that we talked to and everyone at the time. That was her motivation, was to get herself back on her feet, get a career, so then she can be a mother and take Sativa full time. And that was what all her friends said was her motivation to be going to this school.
Where was Richard living at the time of Sheila's death?
Long Island.
Okay.
He's
So
out
it's
in
quite a ways away.
Yeah, he's out in Greenport, Long Island, which is almost all the way, out to the end of the island. So he's out there.
That's a few hour trek just to get here, right? At least
4 hours driving, I would say at least. I mean, easy if you're going with no traffic.
Was she dating at the time?
Not exclusively. I mean, she had different boyfriends listed in the case file, different people that she had seen, socially. She's 22, so still young, still going out, a lot and socializing. So nobody that we see or that comes out from the original case files that was like a steady, low exclusive boyfriend.
And why did you two get involved in this? And who are the original detectives?
The original detectives, there was Tom Mitchell. Dan Jewett was another investigator that handled it.
They were the primaries. Tom Mitchell was an investigator at the time that, like I said, did a lot of the original investigation, a lot of the original interviews with Dan Jewett. Ken King was the detective lieutenant at the time, ran the division. He's done some of the follow-up stuff with Tom as well.
What happened with the case files? They started the case. They worked on it for how long, and then where did it go?
I mean, I know talking with Tom, he's like, I worked the case until I retired. Up until there's still. You could see you get a progression going through of like, all right, 1980, ton of tips, ton of follow-ups, and then you get into 81, and it kind of less, but still there's still some good leads and things coming in. 82, a little bit less, and then from there it just gets fewer and further between that a tip comes in or a call, and then it's always been an open investigation with our department. There's been a couple of tips throughout the years. I think like 2005. There's a call that just came in out of nowhere. We have a 24-hour tip hotline with our department that somebody called in, something with this case, go talk to this person. And then I think that had been it from 2005 up until, Matt and I had kind of took our turn looking into it. And we did a couple of stories of local media, local newspaper, and generated not nearly as many tips as we'd have liked. I think we got like 6 new calls that we followed up with, and we've got a list of our own, just going through people we want to talk to again, or
just to re-interview them, just to see if they could paint a better picture than reading this stuff.
It's interesting coming from this point of view in 2019 and thinking back to 1980, which doesn't really sound like it was that long ago, but it was 40 years ago, right? Yeah. Almost 40 years ago, and everything that's changed, like with technology. Is it frustrating to look through these and seeing like how slow communication was back then compared to now?
We've definitely got it easier. We've got it much easier than these guys. I've said a bunch of times, like, I don't even know how do you come by some of these tips or some of these avenues to follow up of, there was a rape in Ithaca, New York, or somebody that got killed in Buffalo. Like, you may want to look at this guy because he could be connected. How that information even makes its way to Saratoga Springs.
Right.
And then,
so you call up from Ithaca, you call up Saratoga Springs because you somehow think that they would be interested in it,
or even knew that this murder occurred.
And then you have to rely on the other department making that connection on their own.
Sure. Someone's got to make
that connection. Call up. That person on the receiving end has to be receptive to that, and then they have to somehow get the information back and forth. So do they take a trip down there? Do they mail it? Do they fax it?
There's a lot of teletype stuff going through. There's faxes. There's just handwritten. So and so detective wasn't working today, but I took a call for you from this guy, and just a synopsis kind of note type thing. And there was I'm sure they didn't have individual voicemails like we do now, where
no cell phones.
Yeah, I mean, I pictured them smoking a cigarette, and the ashes are hitting the
probably the shoulder holsters and
shoulder holsters. Yeah.
So this is a pretty big case file. It seems like a few binders here.
We're not
it's
experts in
thick.
Case files.
Yeah, is this one of the bigger case files you guys have come across at the station?
I mean, for this, it's we have case files that we've kept, for certain cases. This one's probably one of the bigger ones, just because of the paperwork it generated. When you go through it, even the memos he's talking about when somebody took a phone call, there's memos in there from 1986, took a phone call from such and such, and they would jot it down, and it went in the case file. So that's helpful. It wasn't discarded, and it may not have been important then, or no one thought it was significant, but it's one of those things we want to look at just in case, it was missed or overlooked.
Did anywhere in the case file, any tips come in where someone said, this person confessed to me in this murder, or anything like that?
There's actually quite a few of those.
Really?
Really? There's a lot of, a lot of, they're all followed up, they're all interviewed. I remember one, the mother called in a son because he was lazy and she wanted him to get a job, so she thought that by a sheriff's deputy coming and talking to him, that would motivate him to get out and find a job. There's all sorts. Like I said, this was a huge story in Saratoga Springs at the time. Yeah. And still is, 40 years later, a pretty big story because we don't get these unsolved murder type things. So crazy people calling in just to get attention, people calling in on their acquaintance because they are crazy, and that's enough of a reason to think they were the killer. Is okay, this guy's crazy. You want to look into him, or this guy once said to me, we were dating, I'm going to kill you. So I think it was him. And we had one of those not too long ago.
No, it was one of those things where he somebody showed a particular interest in a cold case. I can't remember if it was this one or not, but the girlfriend kind of took notice of it, and he was always kind of weird to me and stuff. So obviously maybe he had something to do with this.
Yeah.
But it's just like it's like your urban legend. Everyone talks about this case for years on. So,
was there a toxicology report done?
Yes, there was, as part of her autopsy.
Okay, and she did have some alcohol in her system?
Yep, she did have some alcohol in her system. She was at a 0.25 or 0.025 BAC at the time, which is blood alcohol content.
So that's intoxicated.
At the time of autopsy, and she's,
This is at the time of the autopsy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And does that change from the time she dies?
I know it is. I'm not an expert as far as
Yeah.
how it breaks down. I know it's a different rate of,
okay.
Where if you're staying awake, you're going to go down at a, more of a, scientific measure of how much your BACs can go down. I couldn't tell you once you're deceased at what rate. I'm assuming it's much slower. Mm-hmm. The alcohol's breaking down in your system.
So was there a lot of empty alcohol containers in her apartment or something? Or is that kind of a clue to say that she got intoxicated somewhere else that night?
A little bit of both.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole. They didn't say there was a significant amount of alcohol bottles or beer cans or any of that kind of stuff that seemed to jump out at them. I know there was a bottle of.
It's a bottle of vodka.
Vodka.
There's bottles in the apartment, but everyone that was talked to at the time, it's like I said, the timeline is the kind of sketchy part of when she's out and where she's out at. But everyone seems to be in agreement that she was out that night at one of the bars downtown in Saratoga Springs.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So she was asphyxiated, that's the cause of death?
Yes.
And she was tied up afterwards and stabbed afterwards. How rare is that?
Extremely.
Yeah, for in Saratoga, very extreme. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've never heard of a case this.
So there's no other
like
case
this.
that has like a similar MO to it? Any
in
other?
our city, yes. No.
Yeah.
No.
Right.
There were calls that came in. That's I think how they got some of these tips was that I know there was one from Albany where it was I think it was a medical examiner or coroner that had seen something where somebody was stabbed post-mortem, and it jumped out to them because even in Albany where they have much larger number of murders per year than we do in Saratoga, that it stood out to them like, oh, Saratoga had something. And he mentions somewhere in whatever that tip from the medical examiner, he says, I've never seen another one in my career. So it's, even just hearing stories nationwide, I don't know if too many of someone is after death stabbed.
Yeah, so the killer took Sheila's shoelaces out of her own shoes, grabbed a couple of it looks like a bathrobe tie is what you said, and tied her up. Doesn't seem like a struggling Sheila probably couldn't have gotten out of that. It almost feels like ritualistic in a weird way. Like all that happened afterwards. What is there a working motive or theory that you guys have on that? Why that would have happened?
And there's a couple theories that maybe it was to throw us off or throw the police off.
Just to like confuse the scene.
Confuse the scene. That was a thought.
Thought it could have been just a consensual sex gone bad. That she's possibly accidentally smothered, but then again, like Matt said, to make us think that it's something ritualistic or somebody that's mad at her, has some sort of rage. Like, okay, I'm going to stab her because that's what you do when you're mad at someone. But if it's like a rage killing, you don't see one stab wound.
More than one
certainly
stab,
not after they're dead.
Yeah. And there's been no other victims, right? So if it was some sort of ritual, there's been no other rumors of
not in Saratoga or any of our surrounding areas that we know of anything like like this, certainly. So we don't know. Obviously, we don't know, but just talking to different people. Even I think detectives at the time, you get a handful of different answers. Talking to a handful of different people, it could have been someone passing through that she had the misfortune of meeting that night, and this was their thing. But we never jumped out at us because the person then moved on to Oklahoma City or any other city in America.
Now, was there a sign of rape or
no?
No. Okay.
So even if this killer was out with Sheila that night and drunk, perhaps this person was comfortable being with her body after he or she killed her.
Sure.
For how long, do you know, or do you think?
Some amount of time, enough time that they're putting the shoes back, after they take the shoelaces out. They're closing the window when they're going out. They're tying her up. They're, like
Stabbing
I said,
her.
the stab wound isn't, blood is still pumping. There's no spurting blood. There's no, blood stains anywhere. It's, enough that the blood in her body has stopped pumping altogether. So when the knife pierces her dead body, there's a single drop of, the entry of the knife. So it's, it's a decent amount of time, like you said, where they're comfortable, they're methodical,
And they weren't expecting anybody to come to our apartment in any period of time. So obviously they weren't expecting anybody to show up there. So either it was in the middle of the night.
Okay, that's interesting. What does that mean? That means that there wasn't any screaming.
Yeah, I mean,
because if there was screaming, I would imagine that they would be fearful that someone would call somebody.
There's reports when the students come to go see where she is, they can hear music from inside the apartment.
Inside her apartment?
Inside her apartment, radio playing. And then witnesses from the surrounding apartments state they hear music playing. The uncle, when he goes to knock on the door, when he tries the door first, he can hear the music inside. So there's music drowning out. It was obviously loud enough that they can hear it outside the apartment. So does that drown anything? I don't know.
There was music playing from the time of her death, which was Saturday into Sunday maybe?
Yes.
To Tuesday.
Till Tuesday, like a radio playing in the background.
Loud enough where people could hear it outside.
They could hear it at least in the hallway and outside the apartment. I don't know if they could hear it from the street or anything.
Okay.
But
And the neighbors heard it though.
Downstairs neighbor thinks that she hears some sort of party get together, but I think she describes it as not a house party, but like a 3 or 4 person maybe
hanging out,
gathering.
drinking,
So subdued, but that definitely sounds like there's more than just Sheila in the apartment.
So you're thinking that because the door, there was no forced entry.
No.
And the deadbolt, the top one, was locked from the inside.
It's not 100% on that. That is what the Sheila's uncle, who discovers the body, he goes out through this door.
Oh, okay.
He leaves that way and goes. So he was asked at the time, and we asked him again. Obviously, he's gonna be much less clear in the memory of it. But we're like, "Did you have to unlock that deadbolt? Are you sure?" He's like, yes, I want to say that I did, but he's like, I'm also just discovered my dead niece murdered in an apartment, so I'm fumbling to get out of this apartment. So he's like, I'm not obviously the most clear that I've ever been. And
Right. But when people came back into the apartment, it was open.
It was open. They noted in the case report that it was locked. So he does say something to the effect to the police officers, yeah, I did unlock it, or I had to unlock it. But he does go out because the mom and the aunt are actually in the front door downstairs, and he goes out this door to tell them not to come up.
Oh.
And then talks to, I'm not sure, is it a downstairs neighbor or one of the neighbors? One of the neighbors in the apartment actually calls the police for them because they start screaming, call the police, and the neighbor comes out.
So when he goes up to knock on the door and he hears music, he obviously, I guess he tries
the door.
it.
Yeah, he tries the door. It's locked, so they tell him, yeah, try the fire escape. She usually keeps that window unlocked.
Okay.
So that's when he goes up the fire escape.
And he comes in, opens it up. So the thinking is that the person who killed her leaves through the fire escape and shuts the window.
That's the thinking now. At the time, a set of her keys were missing.
Oh.
And that was so that was a big, I'd say a big like hunt or something that was being pursued. Was we find these keys? We find her killer because somebody took the keys out of the apartment. But then they're later turned into the police, where some kids across the street find them like at the bus stop, and it's like I want to say it's like when the snow's like melting, so like spring.
They find keys and then they turn them into the police.
Yes.
Did they know? Did they have any thought that
I think it was
keys?
I think it was the father that knew that they're right across the street from the apartment. So obviously everyone in that neighborhood knows that this woman's been killed in there.
So now it could be the person took her keys and locked the door.
Locked the door on the way out.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I guess like does that matter?
It certainly doesn't clear it up any for us. Because if anything, that just opens it up to that many more suspects.
It feels a little more personal even through the door than the fire escape.
But less suspicious to neighbors if anyone sees somebody walking out the door as opposed to walking out of a fire escape.
Climbing out the window.
Yeah.
Were there any eyewitnesses?
No.